You found TA as a very useful theory, and then obviously in recent years you added a lot to this theory. So I'm curious what made you feel this need to improve and to.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if I've added a lot to the theory, but I do. I suppose I do just naturally question things, and I think that good theory does evolve and change. Or there is a risk that it gets turned into something like dogma. I suppose that's what I was talking about yesterday in the speech, was the need to, that change is a dynamic process, and that it does happen through creating and negating and recreating the theories, the stories that we write to understand things. So, my understanding about transactional analysis has certainly changed since my early training in the late 90s. There's probably lots I could say about that.
Yeah, you can say more about that. And if it's too much, I'll let you know, but I don't think it will be.
Okay. Well, I suppose the thread that has remained consistent is an interest about how we use script or story to kind of glue ourselves together to create a sense of identity. So that's probably where that early article of Cornell's really caught my attention, that it was talking about script in a more constructive way. And Finita English's writing, of course, she was a fantastic example where she was very assertive about her difference with Byrne, that she always saw script as a constructive function, and the risk of psychosis, she would say, if we didn't have a story to kind of hang ourselves together with. So I suppose I have just continued to explore and develop that understanding. And there's been all sorts of influences from beyond transactional analysis on those ideas.
What are the most important influences that you felt were adding something that was missing for you?
The attachment literature had quite a big impact. Fonagy and his colleagues, their research and work on mentalisation. I read a lot of development theory alongside transactional analysis, because I began my TA training a few weeks after my fourth son was born. So I kind of had these funny pictures of me with sort of the baby on one arm and sort of a textbook in the other. But so, he was a fourth baby. I was used to babies by then, but I got really interested in child development. So I've always had quite an equal interest in keeping up with development theory and psychotherapy. So I read a lot of Daniel Siegel, interpersonal neurobiology, Damasio, that kind of thing.
This leads me to another important question, because there have been discussions of your papers in the Transactional Analysis Journal that have differentiated themselves from your approach by having a different understanding of the relationship between interpersonal and intrapsychic dynamics. So where do you think these differences of approach come from? Because they're, I think, very prevalent right now.
Can you be more specific about whose work you're thinking of?
I think it was Bill Cornell's discussing your paper, and also Ray Little.
Ray Little's discussing it. So you're wondering about my difference with their perspectives? I mean, I can't really speak for them.
No, I'm curious how you see the fact that they differentiate themselves in that way.
There are differences with the way Bill thinks and probably works in many ways. So I think he, as far as I understand, sees the therapist as kind of a receiver of the client's unconscious signals, whereas I would think of the therapist as a contributor, both consciously and unconsciously, a sort of transmitter and receiver. That's using an old, Freudian sort of metaphor. But I think, well, my reading and understanding of Bill's work is that he would use his own somatic experience or countertransference to discover the client or understand the client. Whereas, I probably see it more as a two-way street, and that's what interests me most. And probably the way, the word relational gets used in such different ways by all sorts of different people, particularly within transactional analysis. So when I use that term, I think about it as a developmental issue, that it's concerned with the way interpersonal experience is internalised and configures the mind, and it is also concerned with the way the therapist is present as a participant in the process. I think sometimes within transactional analysis it's equated with the quality of the relationship and empathic ways of working, so I don't think of it like that. Probably my thoughts are more in line with Mitchell's sort of what he would call as a relational conflict theory.
So it's basically the roles that we, I guess, assign for ourselves when working with clients, but also probably sometimes the roles that we find ourselves in. Do you ever wonder how your thinking will evolve in 20 years, or how, what your perspective will be then? Do you ever worry about the future in this way?
No, I definitely don't worry about the future. I suppose I more reflect and get interested to see where my thoughts have come from, and a process like this where you get an opportunity to reflect on your own professional development is kind of interesting to see that there is some threads that I can make some sense of it. I can see my own interest, lying more squarely within that intersubjective realm, rather than I think being caught up in external versus internal type dynamics. And what interests me most now in terms of my own work, I think, is the way intersubjective processes are internalised. I think that's what creates change in psychotherapy. I think that's what the client takes away, is that freeing up of that dialogue, playing with meanings, becomes internalised in a way that does free up an internal conversation within the mind, that all the different parts of the self get to speak to each other in a way that creates something more lively and creative and expansive.
I guess in the same way that groups
are
able to
exactly
do that, or
I think that is what's exciting about group work, is you see that all those different voices begin to create a more complex dialogue. And it's that process, again, that becomes internalised, I think, through participating in a group.
So when you work, do you have these different voices that, talk to each other or fight each other? Maybe different therapists that are having a dialogue or a conflict while you're working, while you're thinking about?
I have worked with very different supervisors. I've worked with a neo-Kleinian analyst in a group supervision context for the last 6 years or so. I've worked with a Lacanian analyst for over about 10 years. I've worked with classical transactional analysis supervisors.
So it's very diverse.
Yes, it's pretty diverse. Yeah, and certainly the diversity does create an interesting internal dialogue. It gets kind of noisy in there at times, but it's always interesting.
if you were to meet Eric Byrne and have a longer conversation with him, what would be 3 questions that you would ask him?
3 questions that I would ask him. I suppose I would be intrigued to know how he might integrate recent developments in neuroscience and infant research with transactional analysis. I mean, he always kept up with the play in terms of, what was going on at the time that he was working. He made, clearly Spitzer's work and the Harlow's work and Penfield's work had a big impact on his thinking about psychotherapy. So, I would be intrigued to know how he would work with more recent advances in child development theory. I mean, that's a particular area of interest to me. So I get 3 questions, do I?
Yes.
Okay. that would be one. Maybe I'd be interested to hear his take on some of the kind of political divides within the international transactional analysis community. I think there's sort of perceptions that Byrne was anti-Freud or anti-psychoanalysis, and my reading of his work doesn't suggest that kind of thing at all. So I wonder what he'd make of all that sort of recent controversy.
I'm sure that would be the first thing he would like to talk about.
It would be
clarify.
It would be interesting to hear his own perspective rather than people speaking for him, which I think is perhaps what we've seen a lot of in the last 20, 30 years. What would my 3rd question be? Goodness. I don't know. Perhaps it would be something about, if he'd been able to work and live longer, in what direction he might have seen his work develop.
Thank you very much again for doing this.
Thank you for the opportunity. I've enjoyed talking with you, Marina.
Me too, very much.